All right. All right. So after a million technical problems, we can begin. Thank you all for being here, both in person and our people online this evening. So we're here at 3 p.m, which is why it's sunny. And for those online, it will be less sunny. But at least in your room, but the room will still look beautiful. So welcome to the 7 Churches of Revelation. We're going to be doing 5 weeks of this. And it's going to be a mix of things. We're not really going to jump fully into the churches section of Revelation until next week because there's a lot of groundwork stuff we're going to do that I think is going to help that make sense for you. So I'm going to pull up a map here in a second. We'll start talking forward. But this week is a lot about what it meant to be a Christian in that first century of the Greco-Roman Empire. And so if you're a note taker, this is a good opportunity to take a lot of notes. We'll be doing a lot of history. I think that's exciting, but you might not think it's exciting, but I ask you to hold with us on this because understanding a lot of this stuff is incredibly helpful in understanding the nature of those letters. Those letters in the 2nd and 3rd chapter of Revelation are a little different than the rest of Revelation. You know, you read the rest of Revelation and you often think, what on earth does this mean? Because they're fantastical images. And yet these letters seem to be very, very direct to folks. And they are often, if you have a Bible that has red lettering, they're often attributed to as Jesus himself writing those letters. And so they're a little bit different than the rest of the book of Revelation, but we're going to be looking very specifically at those letters in the coming weeks. So what I wanted to do this week is talk about what it was like to live as a Christian in the first century in the area that is often called Asia Minor. So you can see here on the map, it says Asia right there. You see a couple of areas, Lydia, Phrygia. You see Galatia, where it gets the name for our letter to the Galatians. This whole area, it largely is called Asia Minor. That's not what it was called back then. That's more of a modern scholarly take on that. This was called the Roman province of Asia. But now that scholars have researched it, they will just refer to this whole area right here, which is modern day Turkey, as Asia Minor. So if we're going to talk about Greco-Roman culture, we can't not talk about Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great succeeds his father, Philip of Macedonia, in 336 BC. And he begins on this wild campaign to go and conquer the world. Here we see a map of all of his exploits, including the dates. We all know Alexander the Great eventually dies in 323 in Babylon, with accomplishing, as you can see, quite a lot. Beginning here in Macedonia in a battle in 334, he rises to power and he goes and he begins conquering much of what was known as the known world back then. Now, after Alexander died, there was an obvious huge gap in power because you have this enormous amount of territory, much of which was previously occupied by the Persian Empire. There was a vacuum of power. And so Alexander's empire was divided up against with a bunch of generals. And these new divisions within the empire, they began to fight to try to assimilate and grow larger in power for their area. But because of Alexander, what is known as Greek culture, or as we might call it a little bit later, Hellenistic culture, has been spread through much of the known world. And that's going to become incredibly important, particularly when we get around the time of the Roman Empire. So after Alexander, there were sort of city-states. Some of the big ones were Alexandria in Egypt. That was one of the big city-states. Antioch in Turkey. Now, here's the funny thing. If you want to talk about Antioch, I believe there were around 12 different cities named Antioch in the ancient world. But we're talking about the one in Turkey. And then also the one that we're probably most familiar with, Ephesus, was in Turkey. Those were kind of the major cities of the Hellenistic Greek world. Now, around this same time, in that power vacuum, after Alexander, comes a young general by the name of Lysimachus. And he was this strategic general. He was very young at the time, but he began to consolidate power in the area known as Asia Minor. Now, this is a really kind of a pixelated map, but I'll do my best to point to the areas of importance. And he established Pergamum, which is one of the cities listed as the 7 cities of Revelation, as sort of his main seat of power. He later died against a King Seleucus I, who was a king of Syria, who came over because Syria wanted to capture all this area. And as you can see here on the map, this denotes the Seleucids having control of this area. Philetaerus ruled this area on behalf of Seleucus, and Philetaerus didn't have any kids. Now, this is going to be a theme moving forward. We're around 263 to 241 BCE. He passed it on to his adopted nephew, Eumenes I, as the heir. And Eumenes was the first ruler of this region that said, you know what? We're not going to have these Seleucids, these people from far away ruling us anymore. Let's make this our own kingdom. Now, Eumenes went and started doing that, started capturing other areas around him. But just like the person before him, Eumenes didn't have any kids. And so he adopted his nephew, who goes by the name Attalus I, as his heir. And Attalus did the same thing as his uncle did, expanded the empire and started to control more territories. And Pergamum, as you can see here, becomes one of the greatest cities in the world. It is known to have a library that is larger than every other library in the world except for Alexandria. So Pergamum continues to grow. It's a great city, but this dynasty, which is, you might have heard of it, is called the Attalid dynasty, which rules most of this area of Asia, Asia Minor, Turkey, lasted about 150 years. And finally, Attalid III, a few successors down, was tired of it and did this really weird thing where he basically willed his entire kingdom over to Rome. And he did this in 138 BCE. So let's talk a little bit about Rome. We know the Greeks declined after Alexander the Great created this power vacuum, but they spread their Greek culture all over this world that you see here. Rome, because they were great at business, grew more powerful, and the Greeks started to see Rome as a threat. So in 215 BCE, parts of Greece allied with Carthage to start a battle against Rome, and Rome declared war on Macedonia. We might be familiar with Macedonia because that is where Philip II was from, which is where Alexander the Great was from. Ultimately, Rome defeated Macedonia in a battle in 197 BC and then began to battle other parts of the empire. Rome continued to fight against Greece, and the Greeks were finally defeated at the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC. Rome completely plundered and destroyed the city of Corinth as an example to other Greek cities, but the rest of the empire they largely left intact. If you might remember from your studies, what did the Romans do when they encountered the Greek gods? They just renamed them and adopted the culture because the culture benefited them. Romans were some of the most clever people in the ancient world because they allowed the pre-existing power institutions to be used for their benefit. So all these wonderful things the Greeks did when Alexander conquered a place, he established these very normal ways that cities looked, normal patterns of life. Romans just said, let's keep it. Keep it really simple. I know Amy in her sermon this last Sunday talked about that. The idea with Rome was pay your taxes, be peaceful, and if Rome needs help, answer our call. Other than that, live this Hellenistic life and enjoy life. And that's sort of the genius of Rome. So despite being ruled by Rome, much of Greek culture as we know it continued to remain the same, even though as elements of Roman culture started to come in specifically in things like theater. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So Rome was a republic, but we begin to know a lot about Rome when we start talking about Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC. and he was the heir. He was the one, we all know the story, right, of him overthrowing the Senate, ultimately being murdered by Brutus. And after that, after Caesar died, Julius Caesar died, the same thing kind of happened as happened with Alexander. There was an enormous power vacuum. And so what had happened is that Caesar, before his death, decided that despite his natural children, he was going to name his nephew his heir, which is something that's very significant when we start talking about the Bible. In Greco-Roman Hellenistic culture, adoption was more significant than natural lineage because adoption was chosen. So it was incredibly common in the Greco-Roman world to name one's heir by adopting someone that was either a nephew or someone completely unrelated and just saying, I will adopt them and they are my true child who is my heir. That's what Caesar did with his nephew, Octavian. Octavian, the funny thing is he didn't know this. He was actually out fighting and he came back, and when he heard when Caesar had died, he'd come back and found out that he had been made the heir of his uncle, Julius Caesar. So at the same time, when Caesar died, there's the power vacuum, and they divide the kingdom up into something that we call the triumvirate. Mark Antony was a famous general, and he was a relative of Caesar. He was one of the rulers. Octavian was one of the rulers, along with another Roman named Lepidus. And these three people formed the triumvirate. It was an alliance of men that were to share the supreme power of Rome. But like all things, when men try to share power, they eventually fight over it. Now, we might know the story of Mark Antony a little bit. He married Cleopatra of Egypt. And so his seat of power was Alexandria. Remember, we were talking about those major cities. Alexandria is one of those seats of power. Mark Antony did that. Lepidus shows his power in this general region, and then Octavian had Rome and some other areas. But they began to do battle. Octavian first defeated Lepidus with his troops, and then all the troops of Lepidus came on the side of Mark Antony. Now, here's a little interesting tidbit. Herod the Great, the king of Israel, of Judea, this area down here, Judea, which would have been a province of the Roman Empire, was the king about the time of these wars, and he threw his lot behind Mark Antony. Now, Octavian, as we're calling him now, he's the one that eventually wins. He eventually defeats Antony and Cleopatra, and his name gets changed to, as we now know it, Caesar Augustus. And there's this interesting bit in history where Herod, after his good friend Mark Antony dies, loses, he goes and throws himself at the mercy of Octavian, Caesar Augustus, and says, judge me not, I'm going to get the wording a little wrong, but basically, judge me not by whose side I chose previously, judge me instead by my fidelity, how faithful I was to my good friend, and I pledge that to be that to you now. And Caesar Augustus said, that's good enough for me, and allowed Herod the Great to still remain the ruler of the area of Judea located right here. Now, Caesar Augustus, they give him that title, Augustus, the Roman Senate in 27 BC, and he is one of the great rulers in world history. He brings peace to the land. He rebuilds much of the city and the empire. He builds roads, buildings, bridges, governmental buildings. He strengthens armies. He continues to consolidate all the conquered areas around the Mediterranean Sea. And under Augustus, Rome begins to experience peace and prosperity again. And for the next 200 years of the Roman Empire, there is the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Now, we've talked about this a little bit. The peace of Rome doesn't always mean things are hunky-dory, because if you step out of line with Rome, you're going to get burnt to the ground. And it is by that threat, along with the infrastructure and investments Rome made into these cities, that led to this long series of peace. Augustus ultimately ruled until his death in 14 AD, and then his stepson, Tiberius, became the second emperor of Rome. So we see here what I have here. Those online might not be able to see this very well, but this is a timeline of the first about 350 years of Roman rulers. And when we're talking about the biblical time, what we're really talking about here is Octavian Augustus all the way through probably Trajan or Hadrian, depending on where you date some of the books of the Bible. These are when they're being written. Most people believe that Revelation was written during the reign of Nero because of a reference in the book of Revelation, specifically the mark of the beast, 666, is a way of referencing Nero or Neron, as he would have known. It was a common thing back then to take someone's names, and since they are Roman numerals, to add up that name. So if you would take the name Neron and add those things up, you would come up with the number 666. So the mark of the beast is most likely a reference to the Emperor Nero, or also known as Neron. So a funny thing happened when Augustus came into power. The people of Turkey, the region of Turkey, tended to be a lot more religious than some of the other regions. And they went to the Emperor Augustus and said, "We would like to build a temple to you." Augustus was a very savvy person, and he said, "No, you can only do that if you build a temple first to my uncle, Julius Caesar." And so in 29 BC, in the city of Pergamum, as we can see there, remember the great city that had the second largest library in the ancient world, the city of Pergamum builds a temple to Julius Caesar and then to Caesar Augustus. And it's about this time where we see the beginning of what we would call the emperor cult, which is the belief that the emperor was divine. And we see some of that in the writings of Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid. And I'm going to read some things, and let's just listen if your ears peak up and say, "Ooh, this sounds eerily familiar." So the Virgil poet in the Aeneid wrote some poetry about Caesar Augustus and some poetry about Julius Caesar. And one of them is this. It says, they're talking about the night that Caesar Augustus was coronated Emperor of Rome, because there was a reporting that there was a strange star in the sky when this had happened. And so Romans would describe it this way. He said, "We saw the Son of God, Julius Caesar, ascend to the right hand of God the Father, Zeus." So it was the belief of the people that saw Augustus coronated, when they saw this star go up into the sky, that was literally Julius Caesar ascending to the right hand of Zeus. Virgil goes on and writes about the birth of Caesar Augustus, and he said, "Augustus would be a divine king, the one the world had been waiting for, the one who would bring salvation to all the earth, freeing the people from fear and establishing a universal empire of peace." Virgil also writes that Caesar is the Son of God. "Salvation is to be found in none other save Augustus. Augustus is reigning in the fullness of his glory. The entire empire resounds with the sound of the Advent proclamation." Pretty striking, right? That language sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? There's this really famous inscription here, and it's a city in Turkey called Priene. Right here on the left is a picture that I took of this small little shop that was on the outskirts of the main marketplace in Priene, and in it was found this stone. It's since been removed. It's in, like so many things in archaeology, in the British Museum. And this is called the Priene calendar inscription, and here's what it says. It says, "Since Providence, which has ordered all things and is deeply interested in our life, has set in most perfect order by giving us Augustus, whom she filled with virtue that he might benefit humankind, sending him as a savior, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things. And since he, Caesar, by his appearance, excelled even our anticipation, surpassing all previous benefactors, and not even leaving to posterity any hope of surpassing what he has done, and since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good news, for the world that came by reason of him. That's what that says. Wow, right? Wow. It's going to make you read the beginning of Mark's gospel a little bit different, right? It's wild. Right here are some images I have of the establishment of some of the emperor worship. Right here on the top is an image of an area called Antioch of Pisidia. It's kind of in the middle of Turkey. And right there is this, as you can see, enormous temple to Caesar Augustus. Down here is an emperor to Tiberius. That's some of the catacombs underneath. I believe this is a video here that kind of shows you what this temple on the top would have looked like. An enormous, enormous temple right at the highest point in the city where this temple to Caesar Augustus would have been. It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild to consider how quickly this happened. We're not talking over hundreds and hundreds of years. We're talking in a matter of 30, 40 years after Caesar Augustus begins to rule, that particularly the area of Turkey, which was known to be much more religious and mystical than other areas. So there's been a long-running debate of, did the people of Rome and Italy themselves think of the emperor as divine? And they might have, but you don't find as many altars and temples to emperors in Italy and Rome as you do in places like Turkey. Emperor worship was a much bigger deal in Turkey. And all of these things you've heard, you can understand why. I think something that's really important to remember about the area of Turkey in particular, when we think about the church, is the majority of what we know about our New Testament was either written to churches in those areas or actually written within those areas. So when we think about the New Testament, we're often thinking of it as a Judea, Jerusalem, Galilee book, and it certainly is describing those things. But the majority of the writings in the New Testament actually, in the book of Acts, in Paul's missionary journeys, much of which are taking place in Turkey. Much of the letters are being written to churches in Turkey, and many of the Gospels themselves were probably finished in Turkey and distributed there, either first or very soon within the beginning of those books. And so it's, for me, that's a pretty big eye-opener, because I didn't often think of Turkey that way, or as ancients would have called it, Asia and Galatia and Cappadocia. So I want to talk a little bit about what made Rome so great. And I do mean that. I think if you were coming from another culture and you encountered Rome, I think you would have been absolutely amazed at Roman cities. And someone once said that Rome was like the ancient version of McDonald's. They were the ultimate sort of standard bearers when it came from marketing and branding. You recognize a McDonald's the second you see one, be it in Turkey or in the United States or anywhere in the world you would go. McDonald's has a certain form to it. Outside of even the golden arches, everything about it has a generalized look. Now that's evolved over time, but it stays uniform across cultures. And Rome was very much the same way. When they built cities, they would build them with a main road through them, which was called the Cardo Maximus. Every Roman city from all over the empire had a Cardo Maximus. And this picture alone right here is a pretty good demonstration of that. The one here on the far right is from Hierapolis, which is in the middle of Turkey. The one in the middle is from Laodicea, which is relatively near Hierapolis. And the one on the far left is from Jerash, which is in Jordan, where I had visited 3 years ago. But you can go all the way to Ephesus, you can go all the way to Corinth, you can all the way go to Rome itself and find this same configuration that was this large north to south road that ran through the middle of the city. There was also an east-west, which was also called a Cardo, often minimus, or other terms like that. Those weren't the only roads, but they had these major roads, which, as you can see by each, they're rode by this enormous amount of columns or colonnades, which would have been these large porticos that ran down them, often lined with shops and things like that. So I think that you can see a little bit in these images is there's sort of rough points in the middle. That's actually where the sewer ran. It was a underground, under the road sewer that were in these things. You used to be able to actually climb down in the sewers of Laodicea. I don't know why you would want to do that, but that was something you were able to have access to. Rome also did a good job of setting up what is known as the agora. The agora just simply means the gathering space or assembly, but this is literally the marketplace. This is where business happened in these cities. The one on the top right here is the agora in Ephesus. It's enormous. Some cities had two agoras. They had one that was the general public agora, and then they had one that was more for business of the state, which tended to be a little smaller. It just depended on the size of the city and how many people lived there. Ephesus had two. The one here on the bottom is from Perga, which is down near the coast. It's one of the places Paul visits in his first missionary journey. And the one right here is from Aphrodisia. And what you see there in the middle would have been a giant pool in the middle of their agora. Aphrodisia was a relatively small town that was known for its marble carving. And so of all the places I visited, I think that's the one I would have lived because it was just beautiful. Everything there was beautiful. They took all the time to make a beautiful viewing pool right in the middle of their marketplace. So it felt very palatial and gorgeous. The other things that were really common were the theater. So here we have the theater in Hierapolis right here, which is would have seated 15,000 people in it. The one here, right here, is the theater in Pergamum. Remember Pergamum, that really influential, the other sort of the second Alexandria? That is the steepest theater in the entire ancient world. I've walked that. It's a bit terrifying and beautiful at the same time. You can stand right here. There's a little, you might not be able to see it, but there's a little pole right there. You can stand there and talk at a normal voice and be heard perfectly clear at the very last row. The acoustics are that great. That one seats about 10,000 people. And I should have said, if you have questions, feel free, both online and in person, just shout them out. And if I don't have the answer, I will try to remember and answer in later weeks. The one up here is Ephesus. I'm sorry, this is not the one in Ephesus. This is in Ephesus right here. But this is not the grand theater in Ephesus. Some cities often had two theaters. They would have had the standard theater. So for instance, the one in Ephesus would have seated 25,000 people. But this right here is called the Odeum. Some cities had two. They would have a standard theater, and then they had one called an Odeum, which often had a roof over it, which would be the one that like the council of the city would meet in, or smaller gatherings. They're typically smaller. So even though this is quite large, this is actually the small one from Ephesus. The one at Ephesus is just, frankly, it's spectacular. They had all these key features to them. The large area in the bottom is called the orchestra. We think of an orchestra as in the orchestra pit where music would be, but that's not what would happen there. That's primarily where dancers would be. Then you, of course, have the main platform area. A lot of these theaters don't have them, obviously, because particularly in places like Turkey, every 20 to 30 years, there would often be horrific earthquakes. You would find the fall of many of these cities would trace the same timelines because they would grow in power and then an earthquake would just destroy it. But these theaters often had multiple levels of that backdrop that would contain images of gods or images of emperors. There they would put on plays, obviously, but one of the genius things about Rome was they recognized in entertaining people, you could also educate people about what Rome was. And so often many of the plays would be about Roman conquest and battle, or about the foundation of Rome, or about the divinity of an emperor. And they would be mime, pantomime, comedy, tragedy, or sort of those traditional forms of things. That's probably the area I'm least educated on. But it was often some of them, like Laodicea. Laodicea had two different theaters, and one was an Odeum. One was not an Odeum. They were both outdoor amphitheaters that set over 15,000, and I kid you not, they're less than a quarter mile from each other. It's astounding how important theater was for the life of an ancient city. So there's that. There's also the Palestra, this is from Sardis, which is the gymnasium, which is where men and women would go and wrestle and work out and do those sort of things. And those things were often connected to bathhouses. And I've talked about this from time to time in my sermons. This is the bathhouse in Perga, and these are the gates to the bathhouse in Hierapolis, both in Turkey. The bathhouse was an interesting thing. It had a main changing room in it, which is called the apoditerium. It had a swimming pool, the natatio. It had the frigidarium, which sounds a little bit like a refrigerator, which you would be riding, connecting those pieces. That's the cool bathing room. And then there was the caldarium, which is the hot bathing room. And bathhouses were where everything happened. Everything seedy, everything business-wise, business networking, business deals. Bathhouses is where lectures would be held. And so if you're talking about someone who was a philosopher or someone wanting to give a speech, it was often done at a bathhouse, sort of there in the main bathing area. Prostitution, business deals, all those things happening within the context of a bathhouse. The way they did baths was really strange. We think of baths, obviously, as soap and water and things like that, but the way a Greek, someone in Hellenistic culture would have bathed was the end result ultimately would have been covered with olive oil and having somebody with a tiny scraper scrape the oil from your skin. That's what it was considered to be, sort of the apex of cleanliness. The wealthiest of wealthy would have that to them, just your skin, put olive oil. I don't know what that would feel like. I can't imagine that feeling great, but that's what it was. We talked about this a little bit. This is the stadium. The two on the right are from Aphrodisia, and the one on the left is the stadium from Perga, which I'll eventually walk into here in a second. This is part of Greek and Roman culture. This is one of those things from Greeks that Rome eventually just sort of adopted and ran with, quite literally, where athletics were a major component of the Roman life. I can't remember the exact number, but there was an enormous number, north of 80 days that Romans had off as holidays, and many of those were filled with athletic games, not only for the best of the best, but also people of all ages and abilities to be able to participate in these races. A lot of the races were around 200 meters. Of course, we know of the marathon, but that's more a modern creation as a result. But most of the races were much closer to things like sprints. There were occasionally distance events. We're also familiar with gladiatorial battles. We're not going to talk about that as much. Sometimes those would happen in stadiums. This stadium in particular, the reverse angle of this, there's a kind of cutout round area where in Aphrodisia, if they had gladiatorial battles or public executions, they would happen there. Those things were treated like theater events, which is really sort of insane to think about. That, come on kids, let's go down and watch a beheading or watch someone recreate a battle as we kill these prisoners. A really barbaristic culture in many ways. So the other thing that would have been present in every one of these cities, every major city has all of these elements. It's one of the strangest things is I've been to Jerash, which is in Jordan, and I've been to Ephesus, which is in Turkey. These are enormous distances from each other. You know, if you've ever been to Greece, you've probably been in cities like this, and yet there's a familiarity to them. In some ways, it almost makes each new city you visit seem less unique. It's like, oh, great, more marble. Oh, great, more columns. Oh, great, another theater. Oh, great, another stadium. You see all of these elements, but that's sort of the genius because you know if you were a traveling merchant, you can go from one city to the next and you can rely on the soldiers to keep you safe between the distances because there were garrisons stationed at regular intervals along the major Roman roads. You would have been safe in your travels there, and you would have had a marketplace where you would have been able to have fair dealings with people in every city in those agoras. And so it's just really a genius thing. There also would have been temples. On this column here, on the header of this column, I stuck that banana there because I didn't think the picture did justice about how enormous that column is. It's just absolutely huge. It's, Yeah, you can see it it's tiny right there. It is massive. These are, when we actually talk specifically about Sardis, these two are from Sardis. We'll talk about the Artemis temple there because the size of it was just astounding. The columns here and then the columns in Ephesus, the temple to Artemis, were just astoundingly large. The temple to Artemis in Ephesus only has one column left standing, but it's known as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And they're actually beginning the process just now to excavate a little bit more of it to try to build some of it back up, although like many other things in Turkey have been destroyed multiple times over the year. But we'll talk about that's kind of a funny story. The one on the left is the temple to Artemis in Didyma. You have heard of the, my mind just went blank. Who is the famous place that has the visionary in Greece? Do you know what I'm talking about? The Oracle of Delphi. So if you're familiar with the Oracle of Delphi, it was often a young woman who was taken, most scholars believe that she was either exposed to hallucinogenic chemicals leaching from a stream or drugged up, but essentially a priest would go and ask her, you would go to this priest and say, can the oracle tell me an answer to this? The priest would go and whisper it to this young woman. The young woman would utter something, the priest would come back, interpret that, and give you the answer. That's what happened in Delphi. Another oracle, the second most important oracle in the world, was here in this place called Didyma, which is where that one on the left was. There was an underground stream there where a lot of just, dangerous chemicals were leaching up and coming up out of that. And so it seems possible that that's how the oracle would have functioned. These young women were virgins and were known to have incredibly short lifespans as a result of the exposure to these toxins. But you would have found temporals all over each city. In addition to, not every city necessarily had a temple to the emperor, but most did, to the different emperors. Certainly would have had individual shrines, but they also had temples to their local gods. One of the ones I didn't realize until actually being there, that gives you, see, there's some people standing there. That gives you a sense of the scale of that column. It's just astounding. Someone did an estimate of how long it would have taken for a person to carve out those things. Those are called column drums. As you can see, they're assembled in segments, but just simply to carve those things out would have been an entire lifetime of work in order to do that. One of the things I didn't necessarily realize is because when you think about the gods, our minds often go to Zeus, the king of the gods. We sort of think in that category. But when you actually get on the ground in many places, specifically in Turkey, you find more temples to Artemis than anything. Do you all know what Artemis is the goddess of? Fertility. Yeah, so right there in the middle is a statue to Artemis. All those ball-shaped things on them are literally bull's testes. That's what that's meant to evoke, fertility. If you talk about an ancient world where 50% of women died in childbirth, over time, you start to understand why this sort of devotion to a god of fertility becomes so important to folks. So, you can see here I've done a little video that scans out and shows you just sort of the full size of that. It's just an astoundingly large and beautiful place. Other things that Rome sort of did that benefited culture was just, there was a sense of grandeur and identity. Everywhere you went, you'd see enormous gates like this. This one here on the left is in Jerash. It was built to commemorate the visitation of an emperor to there. So you would have that Roman identity. Roman citizenship would have gained its privileges. Right here, this is actually parts of the old water pipes. They had running water in the cities. They had sewer. They guaranteed safety. Right here are examples in Antioch and Pisidia, examples of market stalls that were all along the main road there. And it gives you a good understanding of why Rome was so effective at ruling in an ancient world, and why it was also so good at demanding its allegiance. Because if you don't give your allegiance to the emperor, if you don't participate in the worship of these gods and the rituals, you're cut off from all of these things. You're cut off from the market. You're cut off from the city. You're cut off from the safety. You're cut off from the entertainment and your friends and those connections. And you can understand why the peace of Rome was considered good news to so many folks. You can understand why Virgil writes those things about an emperor, because their society can feel so radically different to the barbarism or sort of the wildness of the areas on the fringes. So I want to transition real quick as we go into our sort of last section. I want to talk specifically about the formation of the church in Turkey. Here is a lookout of a valley outside of Antioch of Pisidia, which is a place Paul visited on his first missionary journey. And that gives you a little bit of a sense of what the landscape looked like. It can be very green in places, particularly when you get around Laodicea. It's one of the largest wine producers in the world. It has more wine vineyards there than Napa Valley because it can be very volcanic, really rich soil. But it can also have elements of desertness, but it's also quite high in places. And so those are all enormous factors. And I remember sitting here at this lookout, looking out, just thinking, I literally cannot imagine thinking, well, it's time to grab my pack and start walking the 20, 30, 40 miles onto the next town with just sandals on my feet, a pack on my back, walking on this Roman road. And yet that's the life people existed. Right here is just a map I showed a little earlier. This is the map of what would have been the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus. Quite large all around the Mediterranean, but we see here the areas we'll be talking about in particular: Asia, Galatia, Cappadocia, Pamphylia, Cilicia are the areas primarily, because here are the 7 churches of Revelation. And we'll be going through those in order. Some weeks we'll be doing 2 a week, some weeks we'll just do 1. Particularly Ephesus, we'll be doing just 1 because there's also a letter to Ephesus. So I think in studying that, it makes sense to make that 1 week, and that's what we'll be doing next week. But I want to end our time talking specifically about the Apostle Paul and understanding the relationship he has with these churches. So over the next few slides here, I'm going to be showing Paul's missionary journeys. You can find these in the book of Acts. It's actually listed here. So Paul's first missionary journey is in Acts 13 and 14, and we can see he takes off from Antioch. Paul is a really interesting person because he was born in 6 AD. So he's about 6 years younger than Jesus by our best estimates. He was born in Tarsus right here, which is in modern day Eastern Turkey. In CE 20 or 30, about the age of 14, he goes to Jerusalem and he begins to study under Gamaliel. You might know him as Gamaliel. We hear word of him in the New Testament. He's the one that's part of the Sanhedrin that says, if this is of God, who are we to stand against it? He is the great nephew of Hillel, one of the most famous of the early rabbinic teachers, or he's the grandson, excuse me. So after he does these studies, when he turns about 24 or 25, he begins to persecute the followers of Jesus. He goes up into Nazareth, which would be kind of in this area right here. He goes to Nazareth and in Jerusalem and the rest of Judea in this larger area, and he begins to persecute the followers of Jesus. But roughly in 33 to 36, after Jesus' death and resurrection, he has this experience with Jesus where he's converted on his way to Damascus, and then he leaves and he spends 3 years in Arabia. Now, Arabia would have been probably the area we know as Mount Sinai. That area. In many ways, his sort of story is the mirror image of the Exodus. He goes through this conversion process, but it requires him wandering in the wilderness to make it take, which is an interesting thing. Eventually, he goes to Damascus. He flees there. He visits Jerusalem, where he meets with the apostles. He's invited by Barnabas to come up and teach in Antioch. As I said, remember, there's about 12 different places named Antioch. This is often called Antioch by the Sea. And then, as you can see up there, there's another Antioch that he visits shortly in there. There we see him go off on his first missionary journey. There can be lots of different dates for this, but somewhere around 48 to 47, he goes on his first missionary journey, and he takes Barnabas with us. He goes to Cyprus, and then he goes into Galatia, where as you can see, he lands in Attalia, goes to Perga, up to Antioch, Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. There's some of the different events in that. Eventually, he goes back to the Council of Jerusalem because they want to make sure that the gospel that is expanding up into this area is the same gospel that is being taught down here. As this church begins to grow, the book of Acts gives us this model. It says, "You will be my witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Now we're reaching the point where the gospel is expanding to the ends of the earth, and they have this conference to try to understand, is the gospel that's being preached up here and people are living up here the same as the gospel down here? Paul eventually goes on a second missionary journey, a much longer one, and he's joined by Silas. They go through Asia Minor. This time he goes all the way into Greece. He settles in Corinth, and when he's in Corinth is when we begin to believe that he writes his first letter to the Thessalonians. He, in 52, goes back and visits Jerusalem and Antioch again, and then he begins yet a third missionary journey. He stays in Ephesus. This is where most people believe he writes his letter to the Galatians, and he writes his letter to the Corinthians. If you remember, the Galatia, as you can see here, is just a larger region. So if we read the book of Galatians, it's not written necessarily to a people. It's more an itinerant letter. It would have been read in a lot of those different churches. They would have passed it around. So he travels through Greece, and he writes the letter to the Romans. So eventually Paul returns to Jerusalem. He's arrested. He's imprisoned in Caesarea in 59. He appears before Festus, and he asks if he can go to Caesar himself and appeal, because Paul is both a Roman citizen. He's an interesting mix of so many things. He's a Roman citizen. He's a Pharisee. He's a textile worker in Tarsus, which would have been known as one of the most learned cities in the world. So he's an expert in philosophy. He's an expert in the Jewish religion. He is a Roman citizen. He is a textile worker, which would have been a really valuable thing back then. Paul's an interesting combination of things. And so as a Roman citizen, he can go all the way to Caesar to appeal his own sentencing. And so he does that. He appears before Caesar. We don't necessarily know what happens there, but we do know Paul goes under house arrest in Rome. He writes letters to the Philippians, the Ephesians, the Colossians, and Philemon. Some believe he was ultimately released. Some think that there was another possible fourth missionary journey where he went to Spain. And then he ultimately returns to Rome, where he ultimately dies as a martyr of the faith. And so as we look at this ancient Mediterranean world, it is pretty wild to think that Christianity rather quickly after the death of Jesus begins to move from its center of faith, from being here, then to Antioch, but then eventually to this larger area up in Turkey. And this is where we see, as I said at the very beginning, the majority of our books are either written to or written in this area of the ancient world, which is pretty amazing to see. Another thing to understand, that in the ancient world, Jews were often seen as a little bit strange, but were highly respected in many cultures as being very good with handling money and being good bookkeepers. And so the Jews were dispersed much of this region. And so if you go to any one of these cities, Sardis is a great example of this, you will find synagogues in these cities. And so there would have been in every one of these cities, even before Christianity, probably pretty significant Jewish population, maybe 10 to 20% of that city would have been Jewish. And that would have only expanded later, because if we remember, in 70 BC, Jerusalem and the temple were ultimately destroyed as part of the Jewish revolt, which would have sent Jews all over the Roman world. And so I hope you get a sense of, I hate to say it this way, disorientation, that Christianity is a much faster growing, bigger thing than we often realize. And it often moves from the places we associate Christianity to places that we don't often think about. And that's kind of going to be the seed of what we're talking about in these letters, of how do Christians who, keep in mind, they do not have the Gospels. At best, what they have is word of mouth from people who either knew Jesus or knew people who knew Jesus. And so they were following oral traditions of what Jesus did and what Jesus taught. And they have people converting to faith in this area up here, which were most likely primarily not Jewish. They would have been converting from pagan religions. They would have been Gentiles converting to Christianity. And so when Paul is writing his letters and making converts, and when we find the letters in the book of Revelation, we find them being written in that context, living in cities with these theaters and marketplaces and temples to gods and temples to emperors, and combating with what it meant to live out one's faith in those settings. So next week, we're going to specifically talk about Ephesus, which is the largest of all these cities. It's the largest. It would have been over 100,000 people living there, if not up to 250,000. Though it is no longer by the sea, it used to be by the sea, but the river silted in its access to the sea. It would have been a port city. It was just a major, major, major place. And so we're going to be talking about that. So my encouragement for you for next week is to make sure and read before you come the letter to Ephesus in the book of Revelation, and then we'll talk about some of what's specific about Ephesus and how we can interpret and understand that letter. And I think you'll be pretty delighted by the way that expands your understanding of that letter. So here at the end, let's take some time for questions, both online and in person. Any questions I could answer about things? I know that was an enormous amount of information.
Dispersed, wouldn't they give Paul the entree to preach?
Yeah. So the question was, wouldn't the Jews that were dispersed given Paul the entree to talk to people? Yes. Yeah, it was. We don't necessarily know the case in every situation, and if you read Paul's missionary journeys, it's not like he was well received in every place. I mean, there's Antioch Pisidia is one example of that. Ephesus is one example of that. But it would have been a common practice to go first to the synagogue. And as we'll see within the letters themselves, there's often references to what would be called a synagogue of Satan, which can be a reference to the local synagogue, quite possibly giving the Christians a hard time, or in many ways turning them into the Roman Empire. Jews kind of had a special status where they were allowed to sort of maintain and keep their religion in a way that wasn't as scrutinized as Christians. And there's good reason for that, which we will get to. The Christian religion in those early days was much more subversive to Rome than Judaism. But you're right. So Paul would have probably, in most every instance, if there was an established synagogue in a city, gone there to make his proclamation of good news there. Like I said, doesn't mean he was always well received. I think one thing that's really helpful in your conceptualization here is our best guesses on what these churches look like would have been 20 to 30 people meeting in someone's home. So we're talking about really small communities. They don't have buildings. At best, they're someone wealthy in their congregation would provide a larger home to be a meeting space. They might have had to meet in secret because of fear of persecution, although there wasn't necessarily wide-scale systemic persecution at that time. That happened a little later. There still would have been threats because Christianity had a lot of claims and a lot of practices that would have been subversive to Rome, which we'll talk about. So these are very small groups of people that would have been a mix of folks, primarily Gentile converts, but they would have had some Jews, as we talked about in a sermon a couple weeks ago, Judaizers that said, all right, you're great. You're a Christian now. Let's take on some Jewish practices, which was a big point of tension within the early church. Any other questions? For those online, we'll answer them in the chat and things like that. So this video will keep going and to enable us to do that. But any in-person questions? I know that's a lot. Next week, we get into the text very specifically, and we will look specifically at each of the towns. I have lots of great images to be able to share to that I think really expand. There's a couple of them in particular that my experience really changed my interpretation of that in a really encouraging way that I'm looking forward to sharing. So thank you all. We'll see you next week.